Hello Year 9, so hopefully in this video what I'm going to be able to do is to show you how to write a comparison of the two mothers. Now if you haven't read the text at all, I think most of you have, but if you haven't, there is a script posted on Show My Homework, and what you need to do is you need to read from the beginning of Act 1. It's about 7 pages, and halfway through the 7th page, to the stage direction. The melody shifts into that of Mrs. Johnstone. Okay, so once you've got to that point, stop. And hopefully what I'm going to do, there is a supporting PowerPoint for this, and you can have a look at that PowerPoint, but hopefully what I'm going to do is to show you how to write this comparison. So, some of you will have already seen this sheet. Some of you won't. But what we have on this sheet, and it's quite a long sheet, there are a number of statements about Mrs. Johnstone, and there are a number of statements about Mrs. Lyons. And if I take this first one, for example, what I learn is that Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship with her husband. She says, and this is what she says in the play, "My husband, he walked out on me a month or two ago." I know from reading that Mrs. Johnstone looks older than she is, because Mrs. Johnstone says, "By the time I was 25, I looked like 42. I know that Mrs. Johnstone is a cleaner, so she acquires brush, dusters and a mop bucket." So I've got a number of things that I've learnt about Mrs. Johnstone in this column here, and a number of things I've learnt about Mrs. Lyons in this column here. And what I would like you to try to do is to see if you can find any similarities or differences. There are lots and lots of differences here, and 1 or 2 similarities. What I'm going to focus on is these 2 here. Now I've put them at the top deliberately. Okay, I've put them at the top deliberately because these two ideas which link the women together. It's about their relationships with the men. And what I want to be able to do is to use these 2 quotations and these 2 statements in order to write my analysis. So you should also have a page that looks a little bit like this, comparing Mrs. Johnstone and Mrs. Lyons. Okay. Now I appreciate if you're at home it's going to be difficult to print this out, so you might want to, even if you just write these headings down and write your ideas beneath the headings, that would work. If you can print it out brilliantly, if you can't, don't worry too much, and I'm going to show you how to fill this sheet in. So what I have are my 2 quotations about Mrs. Johnstone, my 2 quotations about Mrs. Johnstone and Mrs. Lyons, and it's about their relationships with the men. Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship with her husband, whereas Mrs. Lyons talks very respectfully about her husband. So it seems that both women actually have different relationships with their men. And that's actually my linking statement. That's the one thing that links these 2 quotations together, that both women seem to have different relationships with their men. So I'm going to write this down here. Both women seem to have different relationships with men. Now I know about Mrs. Johnstone's relationship because I have it here in front of me. She has a bad relationship with her husband. My husband, he walked out on me a month or 2 ago. So that's my statement and that's my evidence, and all I'm going to do is to copy this down into this box here. Okay, so Mrs. Johnstone, I'll help if I could spell. Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship with her husband. My husband, he walked out on me. Or 2 ago. Okay, so that's within the quotation marks. And then what I can do is I can write my Mrs. Lyons quotation in as well. Okay, so statement and evidence for Mrs. Johnstone, and I'll move down to the next statement and evidence box, and I'm simply copying down this statement and quotation. Okay, So Mrs. Lyons talks very respectfully about her husband. So she seems to be different about her husband. She seems to be different. She talks respectfully, whereas Mr. Lyons has, Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship. And the quotation is, "I wanted to adopt," and we've got the ellipsis there, the three little dots. Oh, sorry, we've got the word "but," ellipsis. Mr. Lyons is ... Well, it shows that she's pausing. He says he wanted his own son. Not someone else's. Not someone else's. So both women seem to have different relationships with men. Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship with her husband. My husband, he walked out on me a month or two ago. Statement evidence. Mrs. Lyons talks very respectful about her husband. I wanted to adopt, but Mr. Lyons is, well, he said he wanted his own son, not someone else's. Now, I would suggest at this particular point, what you do is have a look through these quotations and find points which are either similar or find points which perhaps differ, show differences between the women. So for example, here's a good one, and if you are really stuck, use this one. Mrs. Johnstone has a lot of children, okay? However, Mrs. Lyons doesn't have any children. We thought children would come along. Or maybe Mrs. Lyons really wanted to have children but have been unable to. So here are some quotations. You can compare this one with this one, or this one with this one. So what you can do is you can write that Mrs. Johnstone has lots of children in your top box, and either one of these two quotations, because both of them show that Mrs. Lyons unfortunately didn't have children, in the statement or evidence box for Mrs. Lyons down here. That's what I suggest you would do now. Stop the video, do that, and then come back. I'm going to give a 10-second pause, and I'm going to talk to you about how to infer, zoom, and explore. Okay, so when we want to make that inference, we're looking at Mrs. Johnstone, and she had a bad relationship with her husband. She says, my husband, he walked out on me a month or two ago. And what does that tell us about her relationship with her husband? Well, it tells us a number of things, okay? Her relationship, it was a bad one. She had little choice in this. She had no choice. He walked out on her. Okay, so I think that's very important. She had no choice. So I'm just going to write this down in my inference box, because that's my inference. My husband, he walked out on me a month or two ago. It showed she had no say in the matter. She didn't kick him out. She didn't leave him. He decided to leave her, and she had no choice. So here we go. She had no choice. And when I look at this, I need to zoom in, and I want to zoom in on some of the language here. Now, I've got to zoom in on some of the language from the quotation. So, my husband, not a lot I can say about that. He walked out on me a month or two ago. He walked out on me. Right, okay, so she had no choice, but he walked out on her. Now, remember, she had 7 children, and she's pregnant, and he walked out on her. What does that tell us about him? Okay, so it tells us that actually he abandoned her. Okay, he's supposed to be perhaps he's her partner, he should be helping her with these children, but he abandoned her. So I'm going to put my zoom on the he walked out on me. That tells me, okay, and what that suggests, that she was abandoned. Now the explore really is, what is the effect on the audience here? As an audience member, we hear that her husband walked out on her. We hear that she was abandoned. How does the audience feel about this? Now, she has lots of children. So perhaps because she has 7 children, so she has 7 children and is pregnant, we have some sympathy. We feel sorry for her that she's been abandoned by her husband. So, just to recap, my husband, he walked out on me a month or 2 ago. What does that tell us? It tells us she had no choice. She had little choice in the matter. What can we zoom in on? Well, he walked out on me, or he walked out, suggests that she was abandoned. How does the audience feel about this? Well, it evokes a sense of sympathy. Because she has 7 children and is pregnant, we have sympathy for her. Okay, so what I've actually got is a statement, evidence, inference, zoom and explore. I've got a seized paragraph there about Mrs. Johnstone. So what I'm going to try and do is to think about my seized paragraph, my statement. I've got my statement and my evidence. Mrs. Lyons talks very respectfully about her husband. She says, I wanted to adopt, but Mr. Lyons he said he wanted his own son, not somebody else's. Now, what do we notice about this quotation? As soon as I see this and as soon as I read it out, I wanted to adopt, but Mr. Lyons he says he wants his own son, not somebody else's. She pauses a lot here. Okay, she pauses here, and the ellipsis shows the pause. And she pauses here. I wanted to adopt, but. Now it seems as if she wanted to adopt, but her husband didn't. Her husband wanted her own children. So what those ellipses do, what those gaps, those pauses do, shows us that she disagrees with him perhaps, but she doesn't want to say so. So what I'm going to say is, she paused the ellipsis, or the ellipses, shows she pauses a lot. So she pauses as if she disagrees with him. So she disagrees with him, but doesn't want to say so. Right, so that's what this quotation, those ellipses, suggest. Now it's really interesting, when I look at the quotation, I'm thinking, what should I be zooming in on? What phrases can I zoom in on that tell me something about Mrs. Lyons and her relationship about her husband? Now the first one that stood out to me was the fact that she called him Mr. Lyons. Okay, she calls him Mr. Lyons. Now that seems to me a very strange thing for a wife to do for her husband. Why does she call him Mr. Lyons? Well, it seems that perhaps, maybe she calls him Mr. Lyons because their relationship is very formal. It seems that, she doesn't call him by his first name like most husbands and wives do. So it suggests that there is a formal relationship there. So she calls him Mr. Lyons, and that's a quotation, so I'm going to put that in quotation marks. So that's zooming in on this part of my quotation. She calls him Mr. Lyons, so their relationship is seemingly, it seems, formal. I don't know yet, I've not really met Mr. Lyons, it just seems formal to me. How does the audience feel? Okay, well this is really quite funny. She has a very formal, she disagrees with him, and she has a formal relationship with him. Now originally I said that it seems that they have different relationships with their men, that actually Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship, but this makes it seem as Mrs. Johnstone has a bad relationship. It seems to suggest, this seems to suggest that Mrs. Lyons has a poor relationship too. So, what we have are two C's paragraphs. One about Mrs. Johnson that evokes a sense of sympathy, and one about Mrs. Lyons that actually evokes a sense of sympathy too. It seems that both these ladies don't have a good relationship with their husbands. Now we know that Mrs. Johnson comes from a poor background and that Mrs. Lyons comes from a privileged background. Okay, so my concluding statement, by concluding these 2 points together, I'm thinking, well, what is Willie Russell, the playwright, trying to show? Well, I think he's trying to show that despite the fact that one is poor and one is wealthy, so despite the fact that one is from a poor background and one is from a wealthy background, they both seem to have problems with men. So perhaps Willie Russell is trying to show that despite the fact they have different backgrounds, they both actually have problems. Now, if you are of a higher level, you will have probably noticed that actually Mrs. Johnson's husband abandoned her, and Mrs. Lyons' husband is the one who is in control here. So I think maybe someone of a higher level will understand that actually it was the men that were dominant. So it might show the men as dominant and in a way controlling of their women. Now that I've filled that in, I actually have two C's paragraphs. I have a linking statement, statement evidence, inference, zoom, explore. Statement evidence, inference, zoom, explore, and a concluding statement. What will that look like when I write it out? So I can't leave it just on this sheet here. I need to write this out as a paragraph, and it looks a little bit like this. Okay, I've started with my linking statement. I've got my evidence, inference, zoom. I've got my explain, explore. And here I've used a connective. So what I've written is, the two women have very different relationships with men. I've literally copied down everything that I've put on that sheet. My planning sheet. Mrs. Johnson says, my husband, he walked out on me a month or two ago, which implies she had a poor relationship and little choice in the separation. The phrase walked out on me suggests that Mrs. Johnson was abandoned, and since she had 7 young children at the time, the audience might feel sorry for her. So I've used my ideas from this planning sheet to write my opening paragraph. Mrs. Lyons is different, so I've used on the other hand. Now if Mrs. Lyons is the same, you could use a connective similarly or also, but I think Mrs. Lyons is different, so I've used the phrase on the other hand or however would work as well. On the other hand, now this is just my C's paragraph. Mrs. Lyons talks very respectfully about her husband. I wanted to adopt, but Mr. Lyons is, well, he said he wanted his own son, not someone else's. My inference, the pauses in the speech suggest that Mrs. Lyons doesn't want to criticise her husband, even though she disagrees with him. The way that she calls him Mr. Lyons also reveals that the relationship might be quite formal. So, and this is my concluding statement, so although Mrs. Lyons seems to have a poor relationship with men, Mrs. Johnson's marriage might not be perfect either. Willie Russell might be suggesting that men were dominant and at that time women were controlled. So I've literally copied my ideas down from my planning sheet to create a nice, secure, well-written paragraph here, and this is what we want you to have a go at. So what you need to do is to find back your quotation sheets, okay, and perhaps one of these two quotations, but it's up to you. You can choose whichever quotations you want. Remember, if you are stuck, if you are struggling with the context, do use your knowledge organisers. There may be one or two ideas, particularly with superstition. If you're writing about superstition, there is a little section on the knowledge organiser about Mrs. Lyons and Mrs. Johnstone and superstition. So good luck. And I will look forward to marking that, or your teacher will look forward to marking that once it is written.